Hello and welcome to a little journey that I am calling Then and Now, a Conversation with Hosea. My name is Derek Hove and I am the pastor at Salem Lutheran Church in Orlando, Florida, where for the next 26 days or so, I'm going to be reading through the entirety of the book of Hosea, looking at it in its own context, and then allowing the prophet to put some questions before us so that we might together be in some conversation with this ancient book, but in ways that might shape our faith today. We won't necessarily answer those questions, but instead carry them with us for further reflection as we continue to read through the words of the prophet each day. Before we jump into today's reading, I want to share some of the resources that have helped shape my study of Hosea. The first is a book called The Prophetic Imagination by Walter Brueggemann. Brueggemann looks at the role of the prophets in both criticizing the way that things are with respect to the way God calls us to be in the world, but then also lifting up a hopeful, different sort of way of being for the future. The second book is the Women's Bible Commentary. This is a look at the entirety of the Bible through feminist biblical scholars, and the particular chapter on Hosea was by Gail Yee. The next one is the Global Bible Commentary, which looks at the whole of the Bible again, but through lenses from various places around the globe. And the chapter on Hosea in the Global Bible Commentary is by Tanya Mara Vieira Sampaio. And then lastly, this interpretation series volume that covers Hosea through Micah by James Limburg. Each day we will read some chunk. Today just a verse. There'll be bigger chunks as we go along. And my readings will come from the Lutheran Study Bible, which is from the New Revised Standard Version translation. Today we read chapter 1, verse 1. The word of the Lord that came to Hosea son of Beeri in the days of kings Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah of Judah, and in the days of King Jeroboam, son of Joash of Israel. That's a pretty quick verse, a list of names of kings, and it may not seem like that tells us too much to get started. But if we take a look at the history of the monarchy, we find that there actually is quite a bit that's said in giving us this list of names. When the people of Israel asked God for a king, Saul was the first monarch that they were given. Saul was followed by David. David's son Solomon succeeded him. And after Solomon, there was conflict and the kingdom split. 11 tribes of the north became the kingdom of Israel, and the tribe of Judah in the south became the kingdom of Judah. For 136 years or so, the monarchy unfolded to the point that we get to in our story with Hosea, where we have Jeroboam the second as the king of the northern kingdom, and Uzziah as the king in the south. Now, as Jeroboam was king, it was a fairly prosperous time. But once you get to Zechariah and those kings that follow, 3 of them are assassinated by their successors. One pays off a foreign power. All of them live in chaotic times of shifting foreign policies as they live through this period of the Syro-Ephraimitic War. Both the north and the south were at conflict with one another, as well as trying to seek foreign alliances to solidify their grip on power. In the year 722, before the Common Era, the northern kingdom falls to the Assyrians, and quite a few years later, the southern kingdom falls in 586 BCE to the Babylonians. What this tells us is that all through the time that the prophet Hosea is a prophet, that there is this movement from a time of prosperity into a time of political chaos, that there are shifting political alliances that no doubt would have been confusing for the people, and also created a great deal of uncertainty and unrest as things unfolded. As we move more deeply into the book of Hosea, we will see more criticism of the monarchy. We will see Assyria come up more than once. We will see, along with that, criticism of religion, of the priests, and of worship of the Canaanite fertility god of Baal. And all of that is wrapped up into the imagery that we will see as we work more deeply into this book. Some of the imagery is wonderful things from nature, but there are also some metaphors that are a challenge that we will have to wrestle with as we go. In particular, we will see starting tomorrow that Hosea has a wife, and she is variously described with words that are harsh when it comes to infidelity. Some would say prostitution, other words are used along the way. This is where our Sampaio and Yi are helpful in lifting up some of the troublesome nature of these metaphors, which we'll look more deeply at tomorrow. Today, it's enough to note that when you think about these kings and war and the agriculture and industrial production that has to happen to equip war, those become things where you need a lot of people. You need soldiers to fight. You need people to work fields. You need those that are making weapons and all of the rest of it. And underneath then this political intrigue that we see and the imagery that Hosea brings forth, Sampaio especially would invite us to think about the exploitation of real women that sits underneath that. If you're going to have all of those bodies doing all of those things, your fertility in your community becomes something that control of is helpful. If you can exploit women and control their bodies and get to a point where you are creating soldiers and laborers all the way through, you can support your efforts of war and all that goes with it in terms of those bigger geopolitical forces that are at work that the prophet is criticizing as we go. So it'll be important for us to, as we go, to realize that there are real people that sit underneath the metaphors that Hosea uses, that there are people suffering and struggling at the hands of this political chaos, and that keeping them in front of us will be helpful for our interpretation. Today, then, we can ask what question Hosea might pose for us after just one verse. And as we have dwelt a little bit in the political and economic context of Hosea, we might ask as a first step, what is our political and economic context? And again, we don't have to answer that here together, but before we get to verse 2, that's a good thing for you to reflect on, that when we come back to it, understanding that we too have a political and economic context, and we too have people who are exploited, we too have war and shifting political allegiances and all of the rest of it, which will make Hosea relevant for us as we continue this journey. Thank you for joining me. Tomorrow we will continue with chapter 1, verse 2.